Hey, welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and I want to open today with a question that quietly rearranges everything we think we know about being alone. Is loneliness an emotion, something in the same drawer as sadness or boredom? Or is it a survival signal, as basic and as bodily as hunger, thirst, or pain? Most of us file loneliness under feelings, and we treat it a little like a character flaw. We assume that if we feel lonely, something must be wrong with us, that we're too needy, too awkward, too much or not enough. But there's a growing case in neuroscience that loneliness belongs in a different category altogether. Hunger tells the body it needs food, pain tells you to pull your hand off the stove. And loneliness, in this view, may be the brain's way of telling you that you need other people, a signal built by evolution to keep a social animal from drifting too far from the group. That reframe is the whole stride today, so let me say it plainly before we walk. If loneliness is a signal rather than a flaw, then the question stops being, "What's wrong with me?" and becomes, "What is this signal for?" and what happens when it never switches off. We're going to trace that across 5 stops. Why loneliness isn't really about being alone, why it physically hurts, how it can quietly turn on itself and become a trap, what it does to the rest of the body over years, and finally, what the science says can actually loosen its grip. There's a bonus stop near the end, too, about whether the modern world has accidentally set this ancient system up to fail. Let's take the first step. Here's the finding that surprises almost everyone. Loneliness is not the same thing as being alone. Researchers draw a hard line between objective social isolation, which is a head count of how much contact you actually have, and loneliness, which is a subjective feeling, a gap between the connection you want and the connection you feel you have. Studies that measure both find they overlap only weakly, which is a formal way of saying you can have plenty of one without the other. Some people live alone and feel deeply at peace. Others are surrounded all day and feel unreachable. So, if loneliness isn't a tally of your contacts, what is the brain actually computing? The best current framing is that the brain runs a quiet comparison over and over between the social connection it expects and the social evidence coming in. When incoming warmth, trust, and belonging match or beat what you expected, the brain concludes, "I'm socially safe." When the evidence keeps falling short of the internal model, it flags a mismatch, and that mismatch is a large part of what loneliness is. Some researchers call this a social prediction error, the social version of that little jolt your brain gives you whenever reality and expectation disagree. If you caught the dopamine episode, this idea of the brain as a prediction machine should feel familiar because it turns out your social life runs on similar machinery. This is why the number of people around you can be almost beside the point. What the brain seems to read is not contact frequency, but something closer to felt support, whether these particular ties actually mean safety and value to you. A few brain systems keep coming up in this appraisal. There's a network scientists nicknamed the default mode network, which you can think of as your brain's inner narrator, the part that hums along when you're daydreaming, remembering, and telling yourself the ongoing story of who you are and where you stand with others. In one enormous imaging study of around 40,000 people, the signatures of loneliness converged right on that inner narrator network, and lonely individuals showed a greater represented distance between the self and other people, almost as if the brain were drawing them slightly further away on its internal map. Sit with that image for a second, because I find it quietly moving. Loneliness may live partly in the story your brain tells about your place among others, in a map where everyone is drawn a little too far off. That's not to say the feeling is imaginary or your fault. It's to say the feeling is built from an appraisal, and an appraisal, unlike a head count, is something that can shift. Now, why does that appraisal hurt so much? Not ache, not sting metaphorically, but genuinely hurt in a way that can leave you feeling almost bruised. This is one of the more remarkable threads in the research, and it takes us to our second stop. When scientists put people in scanners and socially reject them, often with a rigged little ball tossing game where the other players suddenly stop passing to them, the brain regions that light up overlap with the ones involved in the distressing, alarming part of physical pain. Two names come up again and again: the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, which together act something like the brain's alarm and distress hub. The leading interpretation is that evolution did something economical and a little poetic. Rather than building a brand new warning system for social loss, it appears to have borrowed the existing pain alarm, the one that already knew how to grab your full attention and make you act. For a young mammal utterly dependent on caregivers, and for adults whose survival ran through the group, being cut off was a genuine threat to life, so making disconnection feel urgent, even painful, was a way of yanking the animal back toward the safety of others before it was too late. That's why researchers argue social pain is more than a figure of speech. The hurt is real because the stakes, in evolutionary terms, were real. I want to be careful here because the science is more nuanced than the tidy headline. The overlap with physical pain is partial, not a perfect copy. A large analysis of those rejection studies found the most reliable activity was actually in the inner narrator network I mentioned earlier, with the classic pain alarm region showing up less consistently than the early excitement suggested. What that likely means is that social pain isn't simply your body's injury detector misfiring. It's a blend of alarm, self reflection, and meaning making. The brain not just registering ouch, but asking, what does this say about me and my place with these people? Still, the link to the body is not just theoretical. One analysis across 139 countries found that lonely people had roughly twice the odds of reporting physical pain, and much of that connection seemed to run through distress. The line between a lonely heart and an aching body is thinner than we tend to assume. So, loneliness is an appraisal, and that appraisal can hurt. Here's where the story turns darker and, I think, more important, because this signal has a design flaw when it gets stuck. That's our third stop. Acute loneliness, the short kind, is meant to be useful. It nudges you to reach out, repair a rift, walk back toward your people. The trouble starts when reconnection doesn't happen and the signal stops being a brief nudge and becomes a chronic state, because chronic loneliness appears to quietly rewrite the brain's model of other people, and it rewrites it in a pessimistic direction. The research describes this as a shift toward negative priors, a fancy way of saying the brain starts expecting the worst from social situations before they even unfold. Lonely individuals, on average, come to anticipate rejection, to read neutral faces and ambiguous messages as colder than they are, and to extend a little less trust. One study found that when a social cue was genuinely ambiguous, loneliness pushed people to interpret it as rejection, and the effect was strongest exactly when the signal was least clear. Think about what that does in real life. A friend takes a while to text back, and where a connected brain shrugs and assumes they're busy, a lonely brain fills the silence with, they've had enough of me. And this happens fast, below the level of conscious thought. In one striking study using electrical brain recordings, the brains of lonely people differentiated social threat from other information in around 116 milliseconds, compared to about 252 milliseconds in people who weren't lonely. Read that again. The lonely brain was flagging social danger roughly twice as quickly before you could possibly decide to feel that way. I'll add an honest caveat because the science polices itself here. This hypervigilance seems narrower than the early sweeping claims implied. When researchers pooled a set of studies using a different attention task, they found no loneliness related bias for negative social words at all. So the vigilance appears to be tuned specifically to rejection and exclusion cues, not to everything negative, which is a more precise and more believable picture. Now watch how the trap closes. If your brain quietly expects rejection, reads ambiguity as coldness, and flags social threat in a heartbeat, you start to behave differently. You hold back a little, you disclose less, you keep more distance, and studies tracking people through daily life show that rises in loneliness predict later drops in social interaction and self disclosure. There's even a neural echo of this, with lonely individuals showing blunted activity in that insula, alarm and trust region during moments when they have to decide whether to trust someone. So the guardedness reads as aloofness to others. Others pull back in response, and the brain files that away as proof it was right to expect rejection all along. The model that predicted disconnection ends up manufacturing it. That's the cruelty of chronic loneliness. It's a self fulfilling prophecy written in prediction and attention, and no one involved is doing anything wrong on purpose. Let me pause on the human weight of that, because it's easy to hear self reinforcing loop and quietly translate it to, so it's my fault after all. It isn't. A brain protecting you from a threat it treats as life or death is not a broken brain. It's an overprotective one, running old survival software in a situation where the software has stopped helping. Naming the loop isn't blame. It's the first crack of daylight, because a loop you can see is a loop you can interrupt. Our fourth stop moves from the mind into the whole body, and this is where loneliness stops being only a feeling and starts being a medical fact. Chronic loneliness has been linked to a genuinely sobering list, including cardiovascular disease, weakened immune function, chronic inflammation, disrupted sleep, depression, faster cognitive decline, higher dementia risk, and even earlier death. The interesting scientific question was never whether these links exist, but how a feeling gets under the skin and into the arteries. And the answer seems to be that loneliness behaves like a chronic stressor. Start with the body's stress thermostat, often called the HPA axis, which governs the release of the stress hormone cortisol. Prolonged loneliness is associated with this system running dysregulated, with cortisol rhythms that are flattened or elevated in ways that wear the body down over time. Scientists have a phrase for that accumulated wear and tear, allostatic load, and loneliness appears to raise it. There's a detail here that ties back beautifully to our very first stop. In one study, living alone, the objective measure was linked to one stress marker, a flattened daily cortisol pattern, and higher levels of a general inflammation marker, while loneliness, the subjective feeling, was independently linked to a different inflammatory signal. In other words, being alone and feeling alone don't just differ in the mind. They leave partly different fingerprints in your blood. Inflammation is the thread that seems to tie much of this together. Loneliness is associated with higher levels of inflammatory molecules, a more pro inflammatory pattern of gene activity, and even a weaker antiviral response, which may be part of why lonely people can be more vulnerable to illness. One proposed mechanism is that chronic stress makes the body's own anti inflammatory brake stop working properly, so cortisol can no longer keep inflammation in check, and low grade inflammation is left to simmer. Over years, that simmer appears to reach the brain. Reviews link loneliness to a smaller hippocampus, the brain's memory hub, to wear in the brain's white matter wiring, and to a pattern researchers describe as accelerated brain aging. Some work even traces a brain heart route, where the vascular damage from chronic stress starves the brain of healthy blood flow and nudges it toward decline. I'm not telling you this to frighten anyone, and I want to hold it carefully, because a list like that can feel like a sentence. It isn't one. These are risks and associations across populations, strongest in older adults, not a fixed destiny for any one person. And the same research that maps the damage also insists loneliness is a modifiable risk. That word, modifiable, is the hinge the whole episode turns on, and it carries us to our final stop. So, what actually helps? Here's the finding that should change how we think about fixing loneliness. The interventions that work best are usually not the ones that simply add more people to your calendar. If loneliness were just a contact shortage, then more contact would reliably solve it, and study after study finds that it doesn't. What tends to move the needle is changing the appraisal, the brain's interpretation of social situations, rather than only changing the raw amount of social exposure. The strongest evidence sits with psychological approaches, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, which in pooled analyses produces a small to medium reduction in loneliness by targeting exactly those maladaptive social thoughts we walked through earlier. In one trial, internet delivered CBT outperformed both a waitlist and another well regarded talk therapy, with benefits that held up months later. There's even a targeted version, sometimes called interpretation bias training, where people practice rereading ambiguous social cues in less threatening ways, and a single session was enough to reduce both threat interpretations and loneliness in young adults. That's a small, almost hopeful thing to sit with. If loneliness partly lives in a brain that expects rejection, then practicing a different expectation is not fluffy self help. It's aimed straight at the mechanism. Other approaches fit the same logic of recalibrating the inner alarm rather than just filling the schedule. In a large trial of over 1,000 older adults, brief telephone delivered behavioral activation and mindfulness both reduced loneliness a full year later. And here's the telling part: the increase in social contact only explained part of the benefit. That strongly implies these tools work by changing something internal, the stress reactivity, the avoidance habits, the negative self focus, and not merely by adding encounters. Behavioral activation, which gently nudges people back toward meaningful, valued activity rather than waiting to feel ready, also improved sleep, mood, and life satisfaction along the way. The pattern across all of it is consistent. Retrain how the brain reads social safety, and the loneliness eases even when the head count barely moves. I do owe you the honest edge of this research, the same way I did with the pain circuitry. The biggest gap is that we can't yet say these treatments visibly normalize the brain patterns we've been describing, because that neural before and after work mostly hasn't been done, and the community level side, redesigning workplaces and neighborhoods and public spaces to be less isolating, is rich with promising ideas, but still thin on hard proof. So this isn't a solved problem. It's a hopeful and actively moving one, which is a more truthful place to stand than false certainty. Before we close, I promised you one more stop, and it reframes this whole conversation at the level of the entire modern world. Here's the uncomfortable possibility. For almost all of human history, we lived in small groups of maybe 100 to 150 people, in lifelong relationships face to face, bound together by shared ritual and genuine interdependence. That's the environment the social brain was shaped for. Now look at the world we actually inhabit, with thousands of thin digital connections, algorithms competing for our attention, remote work, urban anonymity, and a steady decline in the clubs, congregations, and neighborly rituals that used to stitch people together. The question this raises is whether the loneliness so many people describe is less a story about individual psychology and more a story about mismatch. A Stone Age social brain, exquisitely tuned to read belonging and threat in a small face to face tribe, set loose in an environment of infinite shallow contact and vanishing deep community. If that's even partly right, then some of the ache people carry isn't a personal defect at all. It's a reasonable brain responding to an environment it was never designed for, the way our appetite for sugar makes sense in a world of scarcity and misfires in a world of vending machines. And that reframe points somewhere useful because it means the fix isn't only inside our own heads, it's also in how we build our days, our friendships, our workplaces, and our shared spaces. So let me bring the whole stride back to where we started. If hunger tells us we need food and pain tells us we need protection, then loneliness may be the brain's way of telling us we need other people. It's an appraisal, not a head count. It borrows the machinery of pain because connection once meant survival. It can turn on itself and become a trap of pessimistic prediction, and over years it can tax the heart, the immune system, and the aging brain. But at every one of those stops, the same quiet thread runs through the research. This is a signal, not a verdict, and signals can be answered. Here's what I hope you carry out of this one. If loneliness has been sitting on your chest, please hear that it is not proof you are unlovable or broken. It's an ancient alarm, sometimes stuck in the on position, sometimes set off by a world that pulled us apart faster than our brains could adapt. You can work with it by gently questioning the story that everyone is drawn far away on the map, by reaching toward the connections that actually feel like safety, and by being a bit more forgiving of the guarded people around you who may just be running the same overprotective software. And if the feeling runs deep or won't lift, that's not weakness. It's a good reason to reach out to a professional or someone you trust because this is common, it is studied, and it is workable. That's the stride from a lonely brain toward a solution you can actually use. Thanks for walking it with me. I'm Esther Adams. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I'll see you next time.